So, good afternoon, everyone, and very welcome to this Environmental Science Colloquium Series seminar, which is today also co-hosted by the EU project EcoRisk 2050. My name is Anna Sobik. I am professor at the Department of Environmental Science hosting this, and I will moderate this event. So I'm very glad to introduce our speaker, Colleen Lanier Christensen. Thank you so much for joining us and for presenting your work today. We very much appreciate that. So our speaker, she earned a Master of Public Health from the Department of Socio-Medical Sciences at Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health. She also served as a research fellow at the Environmental Defense Fund, where she analyzed methods for applying systematic review methodologies to chemical safety assessment. And currently, she is a PhD candidate in the History of Science department at Harvard University. Her research, as you will hear more about, traces the history of regulatory standards for chemical testing from the 1970s to the present. And she uses archival sources and oral history interviews to examine how chemical regulations have constrained what governments could and could not know about chemical risks. Her work shows how the United States and member governments of the OECD adopted testing standards for the dual aims of protecting public health and liberalizing international trade. Very interesting. I look forward to hearing your talk. But first, to the audience, I'm sure you will have lots of questions to our speaker. So please write them in the Q&A, which you see at the lower side of your screen. And then I will read them out when we have the discussion after Colleen's presentation. So with that, I think we should start. Please go ahead and share your screen, Colleen.
Wonderful. Let me bring this up. All right, that should be visible for folks. Cool. All right. Well, first, want to just thank everyone for having me today, particularly Anna Sobek, Matt McLeod, and John Hader from EcoRisk 2050, and with the department's seminar Eco Series, John Benskin, Diana Katstrom, Teles Oliveira, Carly Baptista Salazar, Julia Martella, and Kevin Noon. I'm really excited to be here with you today to share work from my dissertation, which is a history of regulatory standards for chemical testing from the 1970s to the present. The project as a whole is based on, as you heard, on archival records and oral history interviews. And it examines first how US regulators dealt with toxicity data and the development of good laboratory practice standards. And second, how the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development took up these standards as part of their work to harmonize testing regulations across member countries. I look at how the frameworks they developed affected how regulators could know and act on knowledge of toxicity. And today I'll share with you a piece of this work on the OECD Chemical Testing Program. So I'll jump right in, beginning with a case that is no doubt familiar to many of you. Endocrine disrupting chemicals have become ubiquitous in consumer products, the environment, and our bodies. Considerable research has raised alarm about these chemicals' health effects, yet regulatory action has been weak and slow. Let's take the case of bisphenol A, which has been at the forefront of many of these debates. Scientists have found the substance in over 90% of Americans tested, and say it can cause health problems, including cardiovascular disease, infertility, and altered neurological development. Yet, regulators, including the US Food and Drug Administration, still say that BPA is safe. Why? Well, as Newsweek put it, they've ignored most of the studies. And to a degree, that's true. There have been thousands of studies on BPA, but in the US case, the FDA based their decision on a subset of studies that was performed and funded by industry. But it's not a story of conflict of interest or regulatory capture. Rather, regulators have relied on these studies, and generally not academic ones, because they adhere to data standards created in the 1970s to govern how labs conducted drug and chemical safety testing. These standards are good laboratory practice and test guidelines. These rules, as I conceive of them, have effectively split toxicology into two fields: standardized regulatory studies and investigative research studies, each with distinct scientific practices and knowledge bases. They both produce knowledge about toxicity, but only one has generally been the basis of regulation, despite standard risk assessment guidance that all relevant data be considered. So what I've been investigating is how regulators came to trust standardized guideline studies over non-standardized peer-reviewed ones, and how this reliance has restricted the knowledge regulators can act on. And today, I'm going to tell you a piece of how this happened. In short, in the 1970s, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development grew concerned about the potential trade barriers posed by new national chemicals laws, which had different testing requirements. They feared that companies would have to test chemical products to multiple national specifications. Instead, OECD countries, which produced 70% of the world chemicals at the time, sought to harmonize standards, creating one set of rules by which all would abide. This created a market with defined expectations, where a company could be confident that they'd only have to conduct testing once, and regulators could accept test data generated in any country that abided by the rules. As a result, trade liberalization and chemical controls became intertwined. So much so that it was this International Economic Organization that became the major venue for international cooperation on chemical testing. In creating this system, regulators hoped to protect public health through high-quality data, while simultaneously facilitating trade through uniform standards. But in recent decades, many say this has come at a cost of restricting knowledge. That's because in the drive to prioritize harmonization, participants missed a slide there from what I had. Because in the drive to harmonize, participants prioritized economic and bureaucratic concerns over epistemic ones, and instead creating knowledge barriers. To tell this story, I'm going to take you through the history of the OECD's chemical program, how it came to be, culminating in a pivotal 1978 meeting in Stockholm, and the regulatory frameworks it established in 1980. That'll be the bulk of the talk. I'll then discuss the limits of OECD harmonization efforts and the epistemic consequences of the OECD frameworks, briefly returning to these contemporary debates about the evidence used to regulate endocrine disrupting chemicals. So with that, let me take you back a half a century. With the rise of the environmental movement and increasing concern about chemical toxicity in the 1960s and 70s, governments around the world began enacting new chemical control laws. Whereas prior laws generally dealt with substances intended to have biological effects, drugs and pesticides, new laws required testing for products that might have inadvertent biological effects. So the 1970s became a decade of environmental institution building, as governments around the world sought to establish new controls, build on government capacity to carry them out, and coordinate their approaches. In 1972, the United Nations created its Environment Programme. Other UN agencies also took up the environment as part of their missions. But in the field of chemicals, the organization that took the lead was not an environmental one, but an economic one, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD. And by 1980, the OECD had become the major venue where nations convened to coordinate chemical policies and set common standards for evaluating the health and environmental effects of chemicals. To understand why, we need to look at OECD history. Established in 1961, the organization grew out of the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, which had facilitated Marshall Plan implementation in post-World War II Western Europe. It was a part of a set of post-war institutions devoted to the idea that knitting together national economies would help prevent another world war. In the 1970s, it included these 24 countries, all highly industrialized, non-communist. And since then, it's grown to include all of these countries pictured in blue. The organization is often thought of as a think tank of rich countries, and until recently has more often been the source of statistics rather than the subject of scholarly scrutiny. A small subset of its work is done via binding decisions, which are akin to international treaties. Many of these are environmental, and this will come into play later. Throughout its history, the OECD has championed a quantitative, growth-centric model of economic development. But in the late 1960s, OECD bureaucrats and scientists led lively debates about the conflicts between economic growth, welfare, and environment, framed in terms of the problems of modern society. Many were concerned about the negative consequences of environmental degradation caused by economic activity, contributing to a larger rethinking of growth. And it was in this context that the OECD formed its Environment Committee in 1970, making it actually the first official international environmental initiative, coming as it did 2 years before the UN Conference on the Human Environment in Stockholm, which prompted the creation of the UN Environment Programme. Now, this was important and meaningful, but incorporating the environment into OECD's mandate did not mean abandoning their core goal of economic growth. Instead, they incorporated critiques of growth into a subset of their work. Their foremost concern was not the cost of pollution, but rather the cost of pollution control. This meant that their concerns about the environment were still framed within those of economic development, and its orientation based on its dedication to market-based interventions. As the first Environment Committee chairman explained in 1971, our responsibility is to see that stable economic growth continues to occur, and that institutional arrangements are made so that pollution control works towards a stronger and more effective market economy rather than towards a reduction of market forces. In 1971, OECD members worked out a set of guiding principles that they published in 1972 to direct their environmental work. This is one of the meetings where they did this, pictured here. The most important principle for this story was the principle of harmonizing environmental standards to prevent trade distortions. This required, in their view, it was required to avoid the unjustified disruption of international trade patterns and of the international allocation of resources. This concern here reflects a view of the OECD economic space similar to that of the European Community and later European Union, fractured by linguistic, legal, and technical barriers which inhibited the movement of goods and capital across national borders. Such differences fragmented markets and drew OECD scrutiny. It was particularly concerned about technical barriers known as non-tariff trade barriers. By harmonizing standards, goods produced for and regulated in one market could be efficiently bought, sold, and regulated in another. Now, I'll say more about the practice of harmonization when I get to the specifics of the chemical standards. For now, we can note that policies needn't all be the same. They recognize some justifiable reasons for different national policies and standards, including different pollution assimilative capacities of the environment, different social objectives, and different degrees of industrialization. As such, a very high level of harmonization, while ideal economically, would not be feasible. However, where such valid reasons for differences did not exist, harmonization, in their view, should be sought. With chemicals specifically, as I mentioned, industrialized countries in the 1970s were enacting new laws on substances that had inadvertent environmental and health effects, with these laws on the books by 1970, and more 1977, and more under consideration. This image here is from an OECD document that emerged from the organization's effort to sort out the divergences of different national laws. These laws included requirements for pre-market testing, considerably expanding regulatory purview and testing needs. While the OECD judged that these laws were consistent in intent, they significantly differed in their requirements. They varied as to whether they covered both new and existing substances, the minimum quantity produced requiring government notification, whether notification and data submission was required before or after manufacturing, and on and on. In terms of the testing specifically, they varied as to which tests were required, as well as minute things like the exact length, number of days of animal tests, or the specific species of fish to test. So firms increasingly worried about having to perform testing to the specifications of multiple national regulations. And it's these different technical requirements that threaten to produce non-tariff trade barriers, the types of barriers the OECD was concerned would fragment markets and be a serious threat to its central goal of fostering economic growth through trade. The OECD's Chemicals Group had been formed in 1971, initially focusing on specific chemicals. Early successes included agreements in 1973 on measures to reduce levels of PCBs and mercury, two chemicals that were of particular concern at the time. This work helped to expand recognition of the international nature of the chemicals problem and showed the need for more effective regulatory frameworks. Moreover, it also helped to recognize the value of international cooperation and demonstrated that OECD could be an effective venue for it. By 1974, the group had built sufficient support to expand its efforts, moving beyond a chemical-by-chemical approach. So in contrast to prior reactive efforts, which responded to hazards after they were in the market, the environment, and bodies, a preventive approach would intervene before chemicals were in use. They recognized both the environmental and economic importance of intervening early, preventatively, emphasizing the need to prevent rather than cure environmental damage, and the large economic savings to society that such preventive policies may produce. Once on the market, it was difficult to remove substances from products and the environment, much less bodies. And as learned with PCBs and mercury, this approach was tremendously costly. Assessing the environmental and health impacts of chemical products before they were put on the market could achieve both of these ends. OECD nations viewed the venue as potentially appropriate because members produced the majority, an estimated 70% of the time, of chemical products. The OECD accepted the need to improve protections against chemical hazards. But in their view, while chemicals were indispensable to modern society, this meant that any threats to the industry were of big concern. They were critical to member economies, and they saw the industries in a precarious position, in part due to an industry downturn and the 1974 oil crisis, which had quadrupled crude oil prices. Thus, in the organization's view, since the chemical industry forms an important part of the economies of member countries, this is not the time to impose undue restrictions. International harmonization, they argued, was a rational means of ensuring the development of practicable assessment schemes. The way to achieve this, in their view, was to focus on the data used in chemical assessments. Following its 1972 principles, in 1974, the OECD asked countries to work towards more harmonized assessment procedures. A key aim was for the mutual acceptance of test results, to ensure proper control without unnecessary impediments to trade. But despite establishing the OECD as a venue for chemical cooperation, it had yet to succeed in making it the major venue that it would become. There were some challenges in getting there. They faced a short timeline. By 1975, Sweden, Switzerland, Japan, the UK, and Canada had all passed new legislation. The US Toxic Substances Control Act, passed in 1976, was particularly galvanizing in these international dynamics. Nearly simultaneously, the Commission of the European Communities issued their proposed directive on chemicals, the Sixth Amendment. And there was considerable anxiety, in particular, about how the US and European rules would diverge, creating trade barriers and fragmenting markets. As more countries passed laws, they saw their opportunity for harmonization closing. In 1977, they anticipated regulators would make detailed rules in the next 2 to 3 years, based on the law's timescale requirements, public demand for action, industry demand that uncertainty be removed, and action of other member countries. Because of this, the challenge, they said, for member countries was to develop a timely, effective, and actionable international system before these systems developed their detailed rules. If the opportunity is missed, they said, it will be an extremely difficult, if not impossible, task to harmonize the national control systems once they've been implemented and opinions have been polarized as to what is the best option or procedure for each country. Thus, New national legislation galvanized these cooperative efforts, creating a sense of urgency for countries to act before the window of opportunity closed. But still, despite urgency, they faced slow-moving institutions and a lack of consensus that the OECD should be the central group for harmonization. The European community, for example, instead wanted to negotiate with the US bilaterally. The US, however, insisted on using the venue of the OECD, where it could exert greater influence to negotiate a single multilateral agreement. The US Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, was particularly interested in international cooperation because of failures of the US Toxic Substances Control Act, which failed to give the agency the authority to compel chemical testing. US EPA sought to work with peers to establish international testing standards that would strengthen their hand in compelling testing domestically. But there was some tension around the US role. As one EPA official put it, some governments believed that the US was attempting to use international mechanisms to impose its concepts on other nations. While somewhat resentful, he said, other countries were very dependent scientifically and economically on the US and felt obliged to follow US leadership in setting agendas. Sensitive to these concerns, the US didn't want to be the face of the effort. So after shopping the idea around, they enlisted their counterparts at the Swedish National Products Control Board to convene what they called an informal shirt sleeve meeting at Hässelby Castle in Stockholm in 1978. Swedish officials, in particular Rune Långgren, the head of the Swedish National Products Control Board, who the US made sure were the official hosts of the invitation, they invited high-level representatives of a select group of OECD countries. These representatives were generally very high-level administrators from environmental and health agencies. This map shows OECD members at the time, and it was only the countries here in orange that were invited. They were chosen because they had all already adopted or were considering this second-generation chemicals laws and had, in Sweden's judgment, demonstrated interest in international cooperation. This meeting became a major turning point, recounted in nearly every narration of international chemicals cooperation that I've seen. Over 3 days of meetings, participants focused on the problem of how to test thousands of chemical substances to the specifications of new laws. They agreed together that consistent data requirements, test methods, and laboratory practices would make it possible to trust the testing results of each other and save testing resources, an issue around which there was considerable anxiety. For the sake of expediency, they agreed to sidestep UN agencies and instead expand the existing OECD program and use it as a venue for harmonization. In other words, they had a strong interest in harmonization and saw the US, saw the OECD, that is, as a place where it could be most readily achieved. But it wasn't without contestation. A prominent US environmental health scientist who was invited to speak warned that, in his view, the new science of risk evaluation is incomplete and fragile. He was afraid that the standardization of tests might lead to the freezing of science at its present level. His concerns are echoed in contemporary critiques of the system, which have been central to debates about the safety of endocrine disrupting chemicals, which I'll come back to at the end. But most others did not share this concern, instead prioritizing the administrative need to adopt standardized tests. And I think this emphasizes the whole point. This was really about making toxicity testing amenable to administrative bureaucracy. So this was a huge effort once they decided to undertake it. It required a doubling of resources for OECD chemicals work, paid for by participating countries. The first part of the work was on test guidelines, which built on their existing program begun in 1977, compiling what some called a cookbook of test methods. The how-to manual, as they envisioned it, would enable any properly equipped and staffed laboratory to carry out tests required by governments. To do this, over 250 scientists participated in 5 working groups that prepared reports on different test methods in the areas of physical chemistry, ecotoxicology, degradation and accumulation of chemicals in the environment, and long-term and short-term toxicology. Experts from industry, government, and academia participated, For example, the physical chemistry group, chaired by Germany, enlisted over 70 experts, with nearly the same number of labs participating in laboratory intercomparison tests. In these tests, labs from multiple countries compared results, identifying weaknesses and recommending changes in the protocols on that basis. Over 3 years, these groups compiled 100 draft test guidelines, for example, on eye irritation, neurotoxicity, reproductive toxicity, mutagenicity, etc. The descriptions in the then 1,000-page manual did not constitute new techniques per se, but rather established methods now documented in standardized protocols, worked out by consensus. In some cases, as I've seen in some of the archival documents that I'll be delving into more, they had to take several protocols used in different countries and collectively decide which one should be the basis of the OECD guideline. A sixth group, led by Sweden, worked on a step systems or step sequence testing approach, which established the base set of testing that would accompany initial regulatory submissions. And this framework paralleled the requirements of the European Commission's then draft Sixth Amendment. Next, there was good laboratory practice, which dictated the quality assurance and reporting requirements for testing. This was based on the good laboratory practice rules developed at the US Food and Drug Administration and Environmental Protection Agency in response to problems in testing labs. This is one headline about the investigations, which made the agencies question whether the data manufacturers submitted were reliable. This was of concern to regulators throughout OECD. For example, there was one prolific lab that had done 800 health effect studies that were significant to regulatory decisions for 140 chemicals. The US EPA found that 3/4 of these studies, almost 600, were invalid. Based on these findings, Canada, Sweden, and Finland revoked approval of several pesticides whose data were now suspect, and companies had to undertake retesting all of these substances and resubmitting data to governments. So good laboratory practice was essentially a quality assurance system with extensive documentation and reporting requirements to establish basic operating requirements for labs to avoid these issues. As they conceived of it, good laboratory practice covered the operational aspects of studies, while test guidelines covered the scientific aspects. These work groups form the basis of two 1980 OECD agreements: the Mutual Acceptance of Data, which requires regulators in all OECD member states to accept test data if they were produced according to test guidelines and managed and documented to comply with good laboratory practice. The agreement meant that they all subscribed to the same standards of producing data, such that a manufacturer could be confident they wouldn't have to duplicate tests to multiple standards. They could just do it once. In effect, the decision made toxicology studies legible to and transportable among governments. The minimum pre-marketing data decision then identified the base set of data based on the step sequence testing working group that would be required for regulators to meaningfully assess the safety of a chemical before it entered the marketplace. Implementing these two decisions would not necessarily mean that regulators would make the same decision about how to act on data. That was left to states according to local political preferences. Rather, minimum pre-marketing data would require firms to produce and submit to regulators a specified set of data at a minimum. If these data were compliant with Mutual Acceptance of Data agreement, regulators would be required to accept the data as the basis of regulation. Depending on the test results and national chemicals laws, regulators might then request additional testing. Together, these practices assured firms that tested in one country would be accepted elsewhere, and that they could offer the same package of data to each country. OECD members unanimously endorsed the agreements in May of 1980. Doug Kossel, the US EPA administrator, judged the meeting to be perhaps the most significant international meeting on chemicals, marking a major breakthrough in international cooperation in the field. Sweden's Rune Lundgren thought the decisions provided the tools to make national legislation really effective. Countries considering new laws or updating old ones would wrap them around the OECD framework in order to comply. This included the US and Japan, both of which planned to update their laws to comply with OECD agreements. But harmonization has its limits, which I'll discuss before concluding about the epistemic consequences. At OECD and elsewhere, harmonization tends to succeed when efforts are framed as technical rather than political and don't impinge on national sovereignty. When members have pushed back, OECD staff have attempted to circumvent the positions by making the work more technical and less political. As a forum for harmonization, the OECD has aspired to be an independent site of negotiation, bringing together scientific and regulatory expertise and remaining above the vicissitudes of national politics. But in reality, as you might expect, this separation is incomplete. So if you've heard of the mutual acceptance of data decision and not the minimum pre-marketing data, this is why. In formulating their chemicals laws in the 1970s, two distinct approaches emerged in Europe and the US. Europe, under the Sixth Amendment adopted in 1979, established a minimum base set of data that would be required for all chemicals, including basic physicochemical properties and health and environmental effects, plus additional testing based on given triggers, such as volume or test results. All chemicals in this framework were potentially risky substances requiring test data to be reviewed by regulators. In short, as made explicit in Article 5 of REACH in 2006, no data, no market. The US, under the Toxic Substances Control Act of 1976, however, established no minimum requirements. The agency lacked the authority to mandate testing. So based on identifying information and any test data that the manufacturer voluntarily submitted, the EPA would use its discretion to decide on a case-by-case basis what was needed to assess risk. But even then, they'd have to go through a cumbersome administrative procedure to establish a chemical as risky and warranting the production of data. And over time, this has proved to place the agency in a logical paralysis, unable to compel producers to provide risk data unless the agency already possessed risk data. In short, no data, yes market. So the minimum pre-marketing data decision embodied the European approach of the base set of data required for all chemicals, with provisions for flexible application. OECD decisions are legally binding, and on its face, this agreement conflicted with US law, which is actually precisely why the US EPA wanted it. The US law was intended to incentivize more testing, but due to legislative compromises, in practice it did the opposite. The EPA wanted this agreement because they thought it would strengthen their hand domestically to compel more testing. The US chemical industry, which had representatives that took part in these OECD expert groups developing all of these frameworks, and they often attended as a part of US delegations or as part of the OECD's Business Industry Advisory Council. They weren't fond of the agreement, but they accepted the decision because they thought it could serve as a check on the EPA, which they feared would issue regulations that exceeded the requirements of the Toxic Substances Control Act. So despite reservations from Switzerland and Japan, it was unanimously endorsed in May 1980 because the US supported it. Oh, I meant to show this image. This is just the specific data that was established in the minimum pre-marketing data set agreement. So with US support, it was adopted. But at this time in 1980, when these decisions were initially endorsed, the US delegation was led by President Carter's EPA Administrator Doug Kossel. But the OECD Council, which had to give the agreements a final stamp of approval, did not convene until May of 1981, 4 months after President Ronald Reagan was sworn into office. With new EPA leadership, US policies shifted as the Reagan administration ushered in an era of deregulation. US chemical trade associations seized this opportunity. So instead of using the OECD to rein in the EPA, as they initially sought to do, their new strategy was to have the EPA rein in OECD. They successfully lobbied the Reagan administration to reverse US support, and the Council failed to pass the decision in May of 1981, when the Council did pass the mutual acceptance of data decision. This resulted in what chemical and engineering news called probably the most controversial issue handled by OECD since its founding. Well, probably a hyperbole, it is significant that it was perceived this way in this particular field. Because instead here of OECD disrupting US regulatory politics, the US disrupted the OECD and threatened the vision of this space as an independent site of negotiation above the vicissitudes of national politics. So because of how the agreement was perceived to infringe on US sovereignty under a new presidential administration, instead of adopting the European approach, US politics disrupted OECD consensual procedures and affected away with harmonization of data requirements. Countries now had leeway to choose their own policies. So the US and Japan, for example, which had planned to amend their laws to comply with the agreement, instead didn't quite do that. The US was left with no requirements, and Japan ended up adopting an in-between approach. So while the minimum pre-marketing data decision fell apart, mutual acceptance of data lived on. As a legally binding decision, all countries that join OECD must sign on to it. And in 1997, they opened up the framework to non-OECD participation. And the framework is currently used in all of the countries filled in here in blue. But the thing with harmonization is that it amplifies the strengths and weaknesses of the dominant regulatory scheme. And this has been what's at play in recent debates about the evidence used to regulate endocrine disrupting chemicals. When the OECD adopted these frameworks, they weren't ignorant of potential weaknesses. And toxicologists in the US and abroad expressed considerable concerns about standardization. We saw this earlier with what the US scientists expressed at the Stockholm meeting in 1978, where he emphasized that risk evaluation was incomplete and fragile, and he feared that standardization might lead to freezing of science. Similar concerns were expressed particularly strongly around the development of good laboratory practice in the US. Toxicology must not degenerate into a checklist approach or single-minded observance of routine, one scientist warned, because it is the detection of the non-routine that is the very essence of good toxicology. He worried that these standards would enshrine good practice at the potential cost of fossilization, or at least enhance resistance to change. The OECD group acknowledged such concerns. When they were developing the frameworks, they acknowledged that standardization of experimental techniques might to some extent limit the value of test results. But the benefit, they thought, was greater, because it could provide the equivalent of an international technical language on which the community could build an increasingly useful and coordinated database. And they said, it is understood that such techniques will never be permanently fixed, but must be modified as new scientific findings and laboratory tools become available. So the economic and bureaucratic advantages outweighed concerns about the impact on toxicological knowledge, which they waved off as a concern left to future OECD participants. Moreover, this was amidst the background of concerns about data quality and limited toxicological expertise and resources. So to conclude, in creating this system, regulators hope to protect public health through high-quality data, while simultaneously facilitating trade through uniform standards. And the rules have arguably done a lot of good. They fostered trust in laboratories around the world, facilitated commerce by establishing a stable regulatory environment, and saved time, money, and animal lives by reducing duplicative testing. But many have said they've come at a cost of restricting knowledge. Because of this framework, as I've conceived of it, we've got this divide in toxicology. On the one hand, we've got regulatory studies, standardized test guideline studies designed to be accepted by regulators. Second, research, investigative studies designed to produce knowledge about toxicity. In the case of bisphenol A, as well as other chemicals, regulatory studies based on standardized methods have generally found few adverse effects at current exposure levels. Research studies generally use more diverse methods and newer, more sensitive endpoints, many argue. And while they find more variable results, the evidence base as a whole suggests the need for stronger regulation. So the system of harmonized regulation was created to establish common quality standards to reduce duplicative testing, and above all, to eliminate potential barriers to trade from different national standards. But instead of barriers to trade, we've now got barriers to knowledge. Because for decades, regulators have used reliance on these standards as a heuristic for test quality. The framework prioritized economic concerns over epistemic ones. And in effect, regulators' reliance on the knowledge production practice of standardized protocols created an inability, or at least resistance, to know and act on knowledge produced by other means. Thank you so much for your time and attention.